Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I was working late in an office building downtown. The place had its own multi-level parking garage with one of those little booths where an attendant would sit during the day to collect parking fees. At night, the booth was usually empty. Employees could leave with their key cards. It was almost midnight when I finally left the building. My car was on the third floor of the garage, and the place was eerily silent except for the occasional hum of a flickery fluorescent light. As I approached the stairs, I noticed the light in the parking booth was on, which struck me as odd. The booth was always empty at this hour. Out of curiosity, I glanced in as I passed. A man was sitting inside, hunched over the counter, scribbling furiously on a pad of paper. He wore a crisp white shirt and a dark vest that looked like it belonged to a valet from decades ago. He didn't acknowledge me, and I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the building had hired someone to keep an eye on things after hours. When I got to my car, I realized I'd forgotten my phone on my desk. Annoyed, I decided to run back upstairs to grab it. On my way back down, I noticed the booth light was off, and it looked empty again. I slowed as I passed, peering inside to confirm. The man was gone, but the pad of paper was still on the counter, a pen resting on top. Something about it felt wrong. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to look at the pad. I hesitated, debating whether to just leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I opened the booth door and flipped through the pages. They were filled with names, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, written in the same neat, deliberate handwriting. On the last page, my name was written at the very bottom. The sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell behind me. My heart froze. I turned, but the stairs were empty. I sprinted to my car and sped out of the garage without looking back. I didn't stop until I was halfway home. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of that man and my name on the pad haunted me. The next day, I asked the building manager about the booth. He seemed confused and told me no one had been hired to work nights, and the booth hadn't been used in years. I checked the garage myself after work that evening, but the booth was dark and empty. The pad of paper was gone. A few weeks after that night, I began noticing strange things. It started small. Misplaced items in my apartment, like my keys or wallet being in spots I was certain I hadn't left them. At first, I chalked it up to stress. After all, the incident in the parking lot had left me rattled, and I figured my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, it escalated. One evening, I came home to find a sticky note on my kitchen counter. It wasn't mine. The paper was the same cheap kind they used in office supply closets, and the handwriting was eerily familiar, neat, deliberate, the same as the names in the pad from the booth. The note simply said, "See you soon." My stomach dropped. I checked all the doors and windows, but everything was locked. No signs of a break-in. I told myself it must have been a prank, though I had no idea how anyone could have gotten inside. Over the next few nights, I started hearing noises. At first, it was faint, scratches on the walls, a soft tap 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 on the window in the living room. But I lived on the third floor of an apartment building. No tree branches or stray animals could reach up that high. One night, I woke up to the sound of my front door handle jiggling. I froze in bed, straining to hear. A moment later, there was a soft knock, 3 slow, deliberate taps. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering my address and begging them to hurry. When the officers arrived, they found nothing. No one in the hallways, no signs of forced entry. They assured me it was probably a one-off incident, maybe a prank by a neighbor or a misunderstanding. But I knew better. The next morning, I found another note slipped under my door. "Don't bother." I was done. I packed a bag and drove to a friend's house across town, too afraid to spend another night in my apartment. My friend, Amanda, was sympathetic but skeptical. She thought I was overreacting, that it was likely just someone messing with me. That night at her place, I felt a small measure of relief. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checked them twice. Amanda and I stayed up late watching movies, trying to take my mind off everything. Around 2 a.m., Amanda's phone buzzed. She frowned, then held it up for me to see. It was a text from an unknown number. Let her know I can still see her. My blood ran cold. Amanda's apartment was on the 5th floor, and we hadn't told anyone I was there. We called the police again, but just like before, they found nothing. No sign of a break-in, no evidence of anyone nearby. The number that texted Amanda led to a burner phone, untraceable. I left town the next day. I didn't even go back to my apartment to get my things. I just paid my landlord to clear it out. I moved halfway across the country, changed my number, deleted all my social media. For a while, I thought it worked, but last week, I got a package at my new place. No return address, just my name written on the front and that same familiar handwriting. I debated throwing it out, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You can't run forever. I haven't slept since." The package was the last straw. I was beyond terrified and utterly exhausted. I knew I couldn't keep running, but I also couldn't let this consume me. I had to figure out who or what was doing this to me. I I decided to go back to the beginning, the parking garage. Armed with a flashlight and a canister of pepper spray, I returned to the city late one evening. I felt foolish even stepping foot into the same garage, but I was desperate for answers. The place looked exactly as I remembered, dark, empty, and held me with that eerie fluorescent glow. The booth was still there, its glass smudged and the inside empty. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to see the man from that night sitting there, scribbling away. But there was nothing, not even the pad of paper. I shone my flashlight around, scanning every corner, every surface. Then I noticed something odd. The back wall of the booth, which I thought was solid, had a faint outline, a seam that suggested a hidden door. My heart raced as I pressed against it. The door gave way with a soft creak, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I forced myself forward. The air grew colder and heavier with each step. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, windowless room. It was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, and the walls were lined with filing cabinets. In the center of the room was a table, and on it sat the pad of paper. I approached slowly, my hands trembling. The pad was open, and the pages were filled with more names that didn't seem to end. I flipped through them until I reached the last page. There was my name again, circled this time, with 2 words scrawled underneath. Final step. A sound behind me made me whip around. The stairs creaked as if someone or something was coming down. My flashlight beam darted across the room, but there was nothing there. Still, the creaking continued, closer and closer. I backed up against the wall, clutching my pepper spray, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Then the light bulb flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I don't know how, but I found the courage, or maybe the desperation, to make a break for it. I sprinted blindly toward where I thought the stairs were, my shoulders slamming into walls and my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I made it up the stairs and burst into the open air of the parking garage, gasping and shaking. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I tore out of the garage and drove straight to the nearest police station. I tried explaining what I'd found, but I could tell they didn't take me seriously. A hidden room in a parking garage. A mysterious man with a pad of names. It sounded crazy even to me. When they finally agreed to check it out, I went with them, desperate to show them I wasn't imagining things. But when we returned to the garage, the booth was gone. Not just empty, the entire structure had been removed, as if it had never been there at all. The officers gave me a sympathetic but skeptical look before leaving. I don't know who or what is behind this. I don't know how they knew where I was, how they removed that booth so quickly, or what the room and the names mean. But I do know one thing. I haven't seen the last of them, and I fear next time it'll truly be my final stop. A couple of years ago, I enrolled in a night class at a local university. It was a philosophy course that met in one of those huge, tiered lecture halls. The class was packed, but for some reason, I always ended up sitting in the same seat near the back, 3rd row from the top. It wasn't assigned, but it became my spot. One night, I arrived later than usual, and the only seat left was directly in the center of the very last row. It felt oddly isolated back there, but I didn't have much choice. The professor's voice echoed faintly, as if I was listening to him through a tunnel, and I felt strangely disconnected from the rest of the class. About halfway through the lecture, I felt a sudden chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't the air conditioning, it felt deliberate, like someone had pressed icy fingers along my neck. I glanced to my left and right, but the row was empty on either side of me. I tried to shake it off and refocus on the professor, but out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a shadow moving along the wall behind me. It didn't match the movements of anyone in the room. When I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there, just a blank white wall and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. After that, I couldn't focus. I started feeling like someone or something was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the only thing behind me was the wall and a small, locked maintenance door labeled authorized personnel only. It wasn't the kind of door anyone would casually use during a class, and it didn't look like it had been opened in years. I brushed it off as nerves or maybe exhaustion. The lecture eventually ended, and I filed out with the rest of the students. As I reached the exit, I turned back to glance at my row one last time. That's when I saw it. There, in the seat I had been sitting in, was a figure. Not a person, not really. It was more like an outline of a person, a faint, flickering silhouette that didn't seem quite solid. It was sitting perfectly still, facing the front of the room. My heart raced as I stared, frozen in place. It didn't turn to look at me, but I swear I felt it notice me. The longer I looked, the more I could make out vague details, a shape that was wrong, proportions that didn't make sense. I blinked, and it was gone. I left in a hurry and tried to convince myself I was just tired, but I avoided that back row from then on, even if it meant sitting on the floor. door. A few weeks later, I'd overheard some classmates talking about the shadow in the back row. One girl swore she saw it too, a dark shape sitting perfectly still in one of the seats. Another guy chimed in, saying he'd heard rumors that years ago, a janitor had locked himself in that maintenance room and, well, he never made it out. I dropped the class shortly after that. A few months after dropping the class, I mostly forgot about the incident. Life moved on, and I chalked the experience up to stress, overactive imagination, or a strange coincidence. But deep down, there was always a nagging feeling that what I saw wasn't just in my head. One evening, I ran into a former classmate, Julia, at a coffee shop. She had also taken the philosophy course and immediately recognized me. "Hey, did you ever finish that class?" she asked, stirring her drink. I shook my head. "No, I dropped it. That lecture hall creeped me out." Her expression shifted, becoming serious. "Yeah, I don't blame you. Something wasn't right in there." I leaned in, subtly curious. "Did you ever say anything weird?" Julia hesitated, then nodded. "Not exactly what you'd call weird, more like unsettling. I kept hearing footsteps in the back row when no one was sitting there. Sometimes I'd feel like someone was standing right behind me, even though I was in the middle of a crowded row. It got so bad I stopped going to class entirely." I told her about the shadowy figure I had seen in the maintenance door in the back. Her face went pale. "You're not the only one," she said quietly. "Apparently, that door used to lead to a storage closet, but after they renovated the building, it got sealed up. No one knows why, but students who sit in the back row keep complaining about things feeling watched, cold spots, shadows that don't belong." She glanced around the coffee shop nervously, as though afraid someone might overhear. "There's this story going around. Back in the 82nds, a professor went missing. He was one of those eccentric types who spent way too much time on campus. The rumor is that he went into that closet one night and never came out. Some students think he is still there, or maybe what's left of him is." I laughed nervously, but the uneasy feeling crept back into my chest. Julia continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They say if you sit in the back row alone, especially near that door, you might feel him. And if you do, don't turn around. If you look at him, he notices you." Her words brought me back to that night in the lecture hall. The way I had felt the figure notice me without it even turning. A shiver ran down my spine. "I think I did look," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "I saw something." Julia's eyes widened. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand. "You should stay away from that building. Just don't go back." I didn't need convincing, but what she said next left me even more shaken. "You know how they have security cameras in the lecture halls now?" she asked. "My friend works in the tech department and had to pull footage from that room once. He swore there was something on the tape, something sitting in the back row. He said the chairs moved, like someone was getting up and walking out. But when he rewound the footage, the rows were empty the entire time." I didn't sleep much that night. Months later, I drove past the university campus on my way home from work. As I glanced at the building where the lecture hall was, I couldn't help but feel like it was watching me. I turned my eyes back to the road, gripped the steering wheel tightly, and drove faster. Months turned into years, and I had successfully moved on with my life, or so I thought. I hadn't stepped foot near that university, let alone the lecture hall, but the memories occasionally crept back, uninvited. The shadow, the chill, the stories, they had settled somewhere in the back of my mind like a faint itch I couldn't scratch. It wasn't until last year that I started to feel like it wasn't just in my head anymore. I had been working at a new job for about a year, a standard office gig that required a lot of late nights. The building was fairly modern, all glass and steel, with wide open workspaces and brightly lit conference rooms. But even in such a clean, professional environment, I started noticing odd things. At first, it was small. Papers left on my desk would be slightly out of place, even though I was meticulous about organizing my workspace. My office chair, which I always pushed in, would sometimes be slightly turned or pulled back when I returned from a quick break. I chalked it up to forgetfulness or an overzealous cleaner. Then, one night, I was working late, alone. The office was completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. I had headphones on, lost in a spreadsheet, when I felt it, that same chill, sharp and deliberate, crawling up my neck. I froze, my hands hovering above the keyboard. Slowly, I turned in my chair. The office was empty, just rows of darkened desks and monitors, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to laugh it off and went back to work, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Every so often, I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow flitting past a cubicle, something shifting near the far wall. Each time I turned to look, there was nothing there. It was nearly midnight when I finally decided to pack up and leave. As I grabbed my bag and stood up, I heard a faint scraping sound, like a chair being pushed back. My heart pounded as I scanned the room. All the chairs were empty, neatly tucked under their desks. I told myself it was just the building settling or the HVAC system kicking on. But then, as I turned toward the elevator, I saw it. In the reflection of the glass wall separating the office from the hallway, there was a figure standing behind me. Dark, flickering, and impossibly still, just like the one I had seen in the lecture lecture hall years ago. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, but the space behind me was empty. The reflection was gone too. I didn't take the elevator. I ran down the stairs, all 15 flights, and didn't stop until I was outside in the cool night air. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. The next morning, I emailed my boss and told them I wasn't feeling well. I stayed home for a week, trying to convince myself that it was just stress or a lack of sleep. But when I finally returned to the office, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On my desk, right in the center of my keyboard, was a single piece of paper. It wasn't mine, and I hadn't left it there. It was blank, except for one thing, a small, hand-drawn door in the center of the page. It was unmistakably the same door I had seen in the lecture hall all those years ago. I quit that job a week later and moved to a different city. I've done everything I could to leave the past behind me, but every now and then, I still feel it, that faint, icy chill, that sense of being watched. And sometimes, when I glance into a reflective surface, I catch a glimpse of something dark and flickering, just for a moment. About 3 years ago, I moved to a smaller city for work. The place had a quaint charm, brick buildings, cobblestone streets, and a bustling arts community. I wasn't much of an artist myself, but I loved exploring the murals that dotted the city. Each one seemed alive, filled with personality, stories, and vibrant colors. One mural, in particular, caught my attention on my way home from work. It was tucked away in a narrow alley between two old buildings, a stunning piece of art depicting a sprawling tree with its branches stretching into the sky, each one painted with surreal detail. Tiny figures lived among the branches, children playing, birds singing, even what looked like miniature houses carved into the bark. They felt like a storybook brought to life. I made a habit of stopping by that alley to admire the mural. It was always there, waiting for me like an old friend. One Friday evening, as I passed the alley, I noticed something odd. The mural wasn't quite the same. A new figure had appeared, an unfamiliar silhouette standing under the tree, barely noticeable but undeniably there. The figure was shadowy, almost blending into the background. I assumed it was an artist adding to the piece and thought nothing of it. The next day, curiosity got the better of me and I returned to the alley. The figure was still there, but it had changed position. Now it was further up the tree, standing on one of the branches, gazing down at the figures below. Its form seemed sharper, more defined, as if someone had painted it overnight. I asked around at a nearby coffee shop if anyone knew the artist behind the mural. The barista just shrugged and said the mural had been there for years, untouched as far as she knew. By Sunday, the figure had moved again, this time higher into the branches. It was unsettling now, too human in shape, almost as if it were watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but a gnawing unease settled in my stomach. That night, I had a vivid dream. I was standing in the alley, staring at the mural. The shadowy figure turned its head to look directly at me. Its eyes were hollow, black voids, and yet I couldn't look away. Slowly, it began climbing down the tree, its limbs stretching unnaturally, its movements too fluid to belong to anything human. I woke up in a cold sweat. I avoided the alley the next day. By Monday evening, my curiosity got the better of me, and I convinced myself to take one more look. As I turned the corner into the alley, my heart stopped. The mural was blank. No tree, no tiny figures, no shadowy silhouette. Just a plain, crumbly wall. I stood there, confused and terrified. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have. I visited that mural almost every day for weeks. As I stood frozen, a voice broke through my thoughts, admiring the well. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing a janitor's uniform. He must have been coming out of a side door in the building. There was a mural here, I stammered. A tree with figures on the branches. The man gave me a puzzled look. There's never been a mural here. This wall's been bare for years. I didn't argue. I just walked away, my skin crawling. A few days later, I moved out of the city for unrelated reasons, but I've never stopped thinking about that mural, or what it might have meant. Did I imagine it? Did it somehow imagine me? After I moved, I tried to let the memory of the mural fade into the background. Life went on, and I convinced myself that maybe I'd been overworked or sleep deprived back then, and my mind had played tricks on me. But the story didn't end there. About 6 months after leaving the city, I got a call from an old coworker who still lived there. We caught up for a bit, and then, as casually as you might mention the weather, he asked, "Hey, did you ever see that creepy alley mural near your old apartment?" My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "You know, the one with the tree and all the little people in it. I never noticed it until a couple of weeks ago. It's weird. I'm surprised you didn't mention it while you were here." I didn't respond right away. He went on, describing the mural exactly as I'd seen it, except now, the shadowy figure was sitting on one of the branches, legs dangling over the edge. I stammered out some vague response, something like, "Yeah, I think I saw it once or twice." After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, a chill creeping up my spine. Why was the mural back back. Why hadn't anyone else noticed it before, and why was it changing? I couldn't resist the pull to learn more. Over the next few weeks, I scoured forums and social media looking for any mention of the mural. At first, I found nothing, but eventually, I stumbled upon a thread in a local urban legends group. Someone had posted a grainy photo of the mural, the tree, the figures, and yes, the shadowy figure sitting on the branch. The caption read, "Anyone else seen this? It's in an alley off 12th Street. Freaks me out." The comments were a mix of people dismissing it as graffiti and others saying they'd noticed it too. One comment, however, stood out. "If you see it, don't stare for too long. It watches back." I clicked on the commenter's profile, but it had been deleted. My heart was racing now. Against my better judgment, I messaged the original poster and asked if they'd noticed anything strange about the mural. They replied quickly, "Yeah, the figure moves." My friend said it wasn't there last year, but now it's all over the tree. I swear it's closer every time I look. Gonna stay away from it. Something feels off. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the shadowy figure, wondering how it could move, what it was, and why it seemed to appear and disappear at will. Worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a figure in a painting, that somehow it was more aware than it should have been. Then, the dream started again. I'd find myself back in that alley, standing before the mural. The figure would always be there, climbing down the branches, getting closer and closer. Sometimes it whispered, but I could never make out the words. Other times, it simply stared at me, its hollow eyes unblinking. The final dream was the worst. This time, the figure wasn't in the mural. I was alone in the alley, staring at the blank wall, when I felt a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned, and there it was, taller than I'd imagined, its limbs impossibly long, its body twisted and shadow-like. It leaned down until its face was inches from mine. "Why did you leave?" it whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping against concrete. I woke up screaming. I haven't had the dream since, but I've made a point to avoid any mention of the mural, that city, or anything remotely connected to it. Whatever it was, I think it's still there, waiting for someone else to notice it, someone else to draw closer. Months passed, and I did my best to put the mural and its shadowy figure out of my mind. Life carried on in its usual, mundane way, though I couldn't shake the occasional feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't constant, but every so often, walking home at night, sitting alone in my apartment, I'd feel that creeping sensation of unseen eyes. I told myself it was paranoia, just the residual fear from my experience. One evening, while scrolling through my social media feed, a familiar image stopped me cold. It was a post from someone in an entirely different city, hundreds of miles from where I had seen the mural. The photo showed a mural of a tree identical to the one I'd obsessed over. Tiny figures in the branches, the intricate details of the bark. It was unmistakable. My heart sank as I squinted at the photo. There it was, almost hidden among the branches, the shadowy figure. But this time, it wasn't sitting or climbing. It was leaning out of the mural, one hand reaching toward the person taking the photo. The caption read, "Spotted this weird mural downtown today. Cool, but creepy. Anyone know the artist?" I stared at the screen, dread pulling in my stomach. It was spreading. Somehow, and possibly, the mural had moved, or been recreated, far from its original location. I couldn't understand it, but I knew one thing for certain, this wasn't normal. Against my better judgment, I messaged the person who had posted the photo. I asked where the mural was, trying to sound casual. They replied quickly, giving me the address. It was in a trendy part of their city, tucked away in an alley just like before. They mentioned they'd only noticed it that morning. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to delete the message and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but the pull was too strong. I couldn't help myself. I booked a train ticket and made plans to visit the city that weekend. When I arrived, I wandered the streets for a while, half hoping I wouldn't find the mural. But I did. Tucked into a quiet alley, it was exactly as I remembered it. The sprawling tree, the tiny figures in the branches, and the shadowy figure that seemed sharper, more lifelike than before. It was no longer on the tree. It was standing on the ground, as if it had stepped out of the mural. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. It felt like it was watching me, and this time, I couldn't chalk it up to imagination. The air around the mural felt heavy, oppressive, like the weight of the figure's gaze was pressing against me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a man in a hoodie walking toward me. He didn't seem to notice the mural at all. In fact, he walked right past it without a second glance. Headed. I called after him, desperate for some kind of human interaction to ground myself. He turned, looking confused. "Yeah," he asked. You didn't see the mural?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What mural?" He glanced back at the wall, then at me, his expression skeptical. "There's nothing there." My blood ran cold. I turned back to the mural, and sure enough, it was still there, as vivid and menacing as ever. But he couldn't see it. I thanked him and hurried out of the alley, my heart pounding. I didn't stop walking until I reached the safety of a crowded cafe, where I sat trembling, trying to process what had just happened. The mural was selective, visible to some, invisible to others. Why, I had no idea, but I was was certain now that it wasn't just a painting, it was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in this world. That night, back in my hotel room, I received a message from an unknown number. It was just a photo, the mural, with the shadowy figure in its original position, standing under the tree. But this time, there was something new. At the base of the tree, barely visible, was a small figure, a person unmistakably me. I blocked the number, packed my things, and left the city before sunrise. I've moved 3 times since then, and I've avoided any alleys, murals, or public art that looks even remotely suspicious. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching me, still following me, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows for good. This happened about 5 years ago when I was fresh out of college and desperate for a job. I was applying to anything and everything I could find, and one day I received an email response to an application I didn't remember sending. The email was brief, but it looked professional enough. A marketing agency was interested in interviewing me for a position as a junior content strategist. The company name seemed familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. The interview was scheduled at a co-working space in the city, about 40 minutes from where I lived. The address was included in the email, and I figured maybe this was a smaller agency without a dedicated office yet. That's not uncommon for startups, so I didn't think too much of it. When I arrived, the co-working building was quiet but open, the lobby was well lit, and the receptionist barely glanced up as I walked in. I told her I was there for an interview, and she gestured toward the elevators, saying, "Second floor, room 217. As I got off the elevator, the atmosphere shifted. The second floor felt off, the air was colder, and there was an odd, chemical smell like cleaning supplies, but too strong. The hallway was lined with generic doors labeled with printed signs, law offices, freelance collectives, that sort of thing. Room 217 was at the end of the hall, with a plain black door and no window. I knocked, and a man opened the door. He looked ordinary enough, middle-aged, neatly dressed, glasses. But something about his smile immediately unsettled me. It was wide, too wide, like he was trying hard to seem friendly but was failing miserably. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. The room was sparse, a single desk, 2 chairs, and no personal touches at all. The walls were white, completely bare. I noticed there were no windows, which made the room feel claustrophobic. I sat down, and he started asking questions, not about the job, but about me. Personal questions. Did I live alone? Did I have family in the area? How long had I been looking for work? At first, I answered politely, thinking maybe this was his way of breaking the ice. But then he asked if I'd ever worked late nights alone. That's when my stomach dropped. I stammered something vague, trying to steer the conversation back to the job. "So, what does your agency specialize in?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, his smile fading, and stared at me for what felt like an eternity. "You seem nervous," he finally said. "Are you always this jumpy?" I froze. My gut was screaming at me to leave, but I didn't want to be rude or seem paranoid. I forced a laugh and stood up, saying I'd forgotten something in my car and would be right back. He didn't try to stop me, but his smile returned. This time, it felt predatory. As soon as I was out of the room, I bolted down the hallway and into the stairwell. I didn't stop until I was back in my car with the doors locked. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. When I got home, I tried looking up the company again, but this time I dug deeper. It didn't exist. The website listed in the email was a generic template with no real content, just placeholders. The domain had been registered 2 weeks prior. I reported the incident to the co-working space and forwarded the email to local authorities, but I never heard anything back. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he wanted, but I'm certain it wasn't a job interview. After reporting the incident, I thought that was the end of it. I chalked it up to a creepy scam, something designed to lure in desperate job seekers, though I didn't want to imagine what the endgame might have been. A week later, I received another email. This one was from a different company, one I had applied to and actually wanted to work for. The email was polished, professional, and included a link to schedule an interview. I was still shaken from the previous experience, but this company had a solid reputation and an office in a prominent business district. It felt safe. I scheduled the interview for the following Tuesday. When the day arrived, I double-checked everything, the company's website, LinkedIn profiles of their employees, even their Glassdoor reviews. Everything checked out. The office was in a sleek, high-rise building. I arrived early, took the elevator to the 14th floor, and checked in at the front desk. The receptionist was kind and handed me a visitor badge. I waited in a well-furnished lounge area with other candidates, which reassured me further. It was a world away from the bare, windowless room of my previous interview. Finally, my name was called. A well-dressed woman greeted me and led me into a conference room. The interview interview started off normal, typical questions about my experience, my skills, and how I'd handle various work scenarios. About halfway through, though, things started to feel strange again. The interviewer, who had been friendly and professional up until that point, suddenly paused and looked at me intently. She asked, "Have you ever been contacted by anyone unusual while job hunting?" The question was so unexpected that I laughed nervously. "Oh yeah, I guess," I said. Why, she didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the door as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. Then she leaned forward and lowered her voice. "We've heard reports of fake job postings targeting young professionals," she said. "A few of our applicants mentioned experiences that sound unsettlingly similar. It's important to be cautious." My stomach dropped. I asked her if she could elaborate, but she just smiled tightly and redirected the conversation back to the job. When the interview ended, she shook my hand and told me they'd be in touch. As I left the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her warning. It was as though she knew something she wasn't allowed to say. That night, I decided to do more digging. I searched for news articles, forums, and any reports about fraudulent job postings or suspicious incidents. To my surprise, I found several accounts from people in my city, some eerily similar to my own experience. All of them described interviews in odd locations where the interviewer asked invasive personal questions or displayed unsettling behavior. One account stood out. It was a post on a local forum from someone who had gone to a similar fake interview at a co-working space. They mentioned a room number 217 and a man with a too wide smile, but their story ended differently. They wrote that when they tried to leave, the man blocked the door and wouldn't let them go until they agreed to some vague terms. They'd eventually escaped by screaming for help, which attracted attention from someone in the hallway. The post was dated 2 weeks before my encounter. I reported everything I'd found to the authorities again, but just like before, I never heard back. Since then, I've been hyper vigilant about any job offers or interviews, always verifying every detail. Sometimes I wonder if the woman at the second interview knew more than she let on. Was she genuinely trying to help, or did she know something darker? For a while, I managed to push the unsettling events to the back of my mind. Life moved on. I eventually found a job at a small but reputable company, and things started to feel normal again. However, every so often, I would think about that strange interview and the warning from the second recruiter. I tried not to dwell on it, but something about the whole ordeal felt unfinished. Then, about a year later, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Are you still looking for opportunities?" My heart sank as I opened it. The message was short and generic, offering an exciting role at a growing company, but it was the tone that got to me, eerily similar to the fake interview email from room 217. The email included a new location, a recently opened co-working space across town. It wasn't the same building, but it was close enough to make me uneasy. There were no red flags in the email itself, but I knew better this time. I ignored the email and blocked the sender. A few days later, another message arrived, this time from a different address but with the same wording. It felt like they were testing me, trying to bait me into replying. I ignored it again. The following week, I noticed something strange. While walking to my car after work, I saw a man standing near the parking lot entrance, seemingly waiting for someone. He was dressed casually but looked vaguely familiar. He didn't approach me or say anything, but his presence set me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. The next day, he was there again, standing in almost the exact same spot. This time, I didn't stick around. I got into my car and drove to a nearby coffee shop, waiting until I was sure he was gone before heading home. That night, I started piecing things together. The man looked a lot like the interviewer from room 217, older, glasses, that unsettling smile. I told myself it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. The emails kept coming, always from new addresses and with slightly different wording. One even mentioned the name of the company where I was now working, as if to make the offer seem more enticing. I knew they were watching me. Eventually, I reached out to a friend who worked in cybersecurity. I forwarded them the emails and told them everything. A few days later, they got back to me with some chilling news. The email domains were being registered under fake names and routed through international servers, making them nearly impossible to trace. Whoever was behind this knew what they were doing. That's when I decided enough was enough. I contacted the police again, this time with the new information and my friend's findings. They seemed more interested this time, especially when I mentioned the man near my workplace. They advised me to change my routine, avoid predictable patterns, and keep an eye out for anything unusual. I started driving a different route to work and leaving at random times. I'd even moved apartments, hoping to throw off anyone who might be tracking me. For a while, it seemed to work. The emails stopped, and I stopped seeing the man near my office. But every now and then, I get the feeling I'm being watched. A stranger lingering too long in a coffee shop, a car I lead a little too close to mine at a red light. Maybe it's just paranoia, but I can't shake the feeling that whoever was behind those fake interviews hasn't given up. To the man from room 217 and anyone else in your little network, I've done everything I could to avoid you. Let's not meet. sweet, because if we do, I'm not sure I'll make it out unscathed this time. A few years ago, I was traveling through a small city in Eastern Europe, the kind of place that doesn't make it onto tourist maps. I've been backpacking for months and like to wander aimlessly, hoping to find hidden gems off the beaten path. That's how I stumbled onto the underground market. It was a chilly, overcast day, and I ducked into a narrow alley to escape the wind. Halfway down the alley, I noticed a faint sign above a door. The sign was a mess of faded Cyrillic letters, but one word was clear: bizarre. Intrigued, I pushed open the door and descended a steep set of stone steps into the building's basement. This space was sprawling and dimly lit by rows of flickering fluorescent lights. It smelled faintly of damp concrete and spices. The stalls were a chaotic mix of junk, antiques, food, and oddities, old Soviet-era metals, jars of pickled vegetables, handmade jewelry, and stacks of books in languages I couldn't read. The air buzzed with conversation, though I couldn't catch a single word. One stall caught my eye. It was small and tucked away in a shadowy corner. The vendor, an older woman with piercing gray eyes and wiry hair, sat silently behind a table covered in neatly arranged trinkets. Most of her wares seemed mundane: old watches, tarnished coins, and worn playing cards. But there was one item that stood out: a small, black notebook. Its cover was leather, scratched and weathered with age, and it seemed oddly out of place. "How much?" I asked, pointing at the notebook. She tilted her head, as if assessing me, and then smiled. Her teeth were unnervingly sharp. "It's free, but you must promise to never open it in this market." I laughed awkwardly, assuming it was some quirky local superstition, and accepted the notebook. I slipped it into my bag and wandered the market a little longer, but something about the woman's gaze lingered in my mind. After a while, I decided to leave. As I climbed the stairs back to the street, I felt an inexplicable weight in my chest, like I was being watched. That night, in my hostel room, curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out the notebook and opened it. The pages were blank, except for the first one, which had a single line written in spidery handwriting. He looked. Chills ran down my spine. I flipped through the rest of the pages, but they were all empty. I shoved the notebook back into my bag and told myself I just imagined it. The next morning, I woke to find the notebook on the bedside table, even though I was sure I'd put it away. This time, the second page had writing: "Leave the city." I don't know how to explain it, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The words didn't feel like a warning, they felt like a command. I decided not to test it. I packed my things and left the city on the next bus. A few days later, I was in a new city when I remembered the notebook. I pulled it out of my bag, but the pages were blank again. I tried to convince myself it had all been a weird coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something terrible. I never went back to that market, and I've kept the notebook locked away ever since. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear faint scratching sounds coming from where it's hidden. I'm too afraid to check it. Despite the years that have passed, the notebook still haunts me. It's not something I've shared with many people because, honestly, who would believe me? The whole story sounds absurd, like something from a cheap horror novel, but I know it was real. I can still see the spidery handwriting and feel the icy dread it brought with it. I thought leaving it locked in an old box in the back of a closet would be the end of it, but the notebook hasn't let me forget. Every now and then, I dream about that market. It's always the same. I'm wandering those dimly lit aisles, hearing snippets of conversations in languages I don't understand. The stalls seem endless, and no matter how far I walk, I can't find the stairs to leave. The old woman is always there in her shadowy corner, her sharp teeth glinting as she smiles at me. I always wake up in a cold sweat, and the dreams seem to come more often now. Worse, I've started noticing strange things around my apartment. A faint, metallic smell that lingers in the air, objects shifting slightly when I know I haven't touched them. Once, I came home to find the closet door ajar, even though I always keep it shut. The box with the notebook was undisturbed, but I swear I heard faint scratching when I approached it. Last week, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to get rid of the notebook for good. I drove to a secluded spot by a river far from where I live and threw it into the water. As it sank beneath the surface, I felt a wave of relief. For the first time in years, I thought it might actually be over. That night, I slept better than I had in months. But when I woke up, the notebook was back on my bedside table. It was open to a new page. The words written there sent a chill through me. "You broke the promise. I don't know what to do anymore." I've thought about burning it, burying it, even taking it to some kind of paranormal experts, but deep down, I feel like nothing will work. I'm terrified that whatever is attached to this notebook isn't bound by the same rules as the rest of the world. The scratching has grown louder. I hear it now even when I'm not near the closet. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear faint whispers. I can't make out what they're saying, but the tone is angry. I'm writing this here because I don't know where else to turn. If anyone has experienced something similar, please let me know. I need to know about load in this, and if you ever stumble across a strange market in a forgotten corner of the world, especially one run surrounded by a woman with shark teeth, do yourself a favor and walk away. Don't touch anything, don't take anything, and whatever you do, don't make any promises. Since writing this, things have taken an even darker turn. The whispers have become more distinct. I can't always catch the words, but they're sharp, guttural, and somehow feel as if they're being spoken directly into my mind. It's not just at night anymore. I hear them during the day, faint but persistent, no matter where I go. Last night, I decided to confront the notebook. I opened it for the first time since it reappeared on my bedside table. This time, the pages were no longer blank. Line after line was filled with phrases written in the same spidery handwriting. Some were in languages I didn't recognize, but the ones in English sent chills down my spine. You can't run. You belong to us. The deal is sealed. And at the bottom of the page, scrawled in larger, messier script, was a chilly message: return to the market. The thought of going back to that place makes my stomach churn, but I don't know what else to do. The energy around me feels heavier, suffocating. Shadows seem to move on their own, stretching toward me when I'm alone. My reflection in the mirror sometimes lingers a moment too long after I've turned away. This morning, I woke up with a fresh cut across my forearm. It wasn't deep, but it stung like a paper cut. The skin around it was red and inflamed, and the shape of the wound was eerily deliberate. It was a perfect X. I don't know how it got there. I live alone, and there's nothing in my apartment that could have done that accidentally. I've started seeing figures in my peripheral vision, blurred, indistinct shapes that vanish the moment I try to focus on them. Once, I swear I saw the old woman from the market standing in the corner of my bedroom, her sharp teeth glinting in the darkness. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her presence was suffocating. When I turned on the light, she was gone. I've decided to follow the notebook's instructions. As much as I fear what awaits me, I fear what might happen if I don't comply even more. I've booked a ticket back to the city. It's been years since I was there, and I don't even know if the market still exists, but I have to try. I feel like my life, or my soul, is hanging by a thread. To whoever reads this, if something happens to me, don't look for the market. Don't try to find the notebook. I don't think it's meant to be destroyed, and I don't think it can be escaped. I'll post an update once I get there if I can, but if you don't hear from me again, know this: the market is real, the notebook is real, and whatever is connected to it doesn't let go. A few years ago, I worked in a high-rise building downtown, the kind of place with sterile white hallways and endless cubicles. My office was on the 18th floor, and every morning, I would take the elevator up with a coffee in hand, dreading the monotony of the day ahead. One morning, I arrived earlier than usual to prep for a meeting. The elevator was strangely slow, so I opted for the stairwell. It was well lit, though eerily silent. As I climbed, I noticed a faint humming echoing through the space. It sounded like an old song, soft and haunting. By the time I reached the 12th floor, I decided to pause and catch my breath. The door to the 12th floor was slightly ajar, something I hadn't seen before. The 12th floor was under renovation and had been closed for months, and no one was supposed to be there. Curious but cautious, I peeked inside. The humming was louder now, and I could see a woman sitting on the floor at the far end of the hallway. Her back was to me, and she was rocking slightly, humming that same tune. She wore a faded dress, one that seemed out of place, almost vintage. Her hair was long and disheveled. I hesitated. Something fell off. Excuse me, I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. She stopped humming but didn't turn around. The silence stretched, pressing against my chest. I took a step back, my hand gripping the stairwell door. Before I could say anything else, she started humming again, louder this time, the tune discordant and grating. The rocking became more erratic. I bolted up the stairs without another glance, my heart pounding. When I reached my office, I told a coworker what I'd seen. He frowned and told me something that made my blood run cold. The 12th floor had been closed after a fire broke out 2 years earlier. A woman, a secretary, he thought, had died in the blaze. No one had been allowed back in since. I laughed it off, saying it was probably a squatter or someone who'd snuck in. But later that day, I overheard the building manager talking to security. They reviewed the cameras, and no one else had entered the stairwell that morning. A week later, I convinced myself the experience was just an overreaction. Stress, an early morning, and too much coffee had probably made my imagination run wild. Still, I avoided the stairwell. Every time I passed the closed-off door on the 12th floor while riding the elevator, my stomach churned. Then one evening, I had to work late. By the time I finished, it was past 9 p.m. and the office was eerily quiet. The elevator service had become unreliable after hours, often stopping for maintenance or getting stuck between floors. I debated waiting for it but decided to take the stairs to avoid being trapped. The stairwell was dimly lit now, with only every other bulb working. I kept my steps brisk, my shoes echoing sharply against the concrete. As I descended past the 13th floor, I noticed the door to the 12th floor floor was ajar again. My breath hitched, but I kept moving. That humming started again. It was faint at first, as if the sound was carried by the air itself. I froze. The melody was unmistakable, the same haunting tune I'd heard before. I couldn't resist looking through the small glass pane of the 12th floor door. The hallway beyond was darker than I remembered, with shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. And there she was again, standing this time. Her back was still to me, but she was swaying side to side like before, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening for something. Leave, I whispered to myself, but I couldn't move. As if she'd heard me, she stopped swaying. Slowly, she began to turn her head, but her body remained unnaturally still, her neck twisting further than seemed possible. I stumbled back, tripping over a step as her face came into view. Her eyes were black hollows, her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. The humming was no longer soft. It filled the entire stairwell, a chaotic, discordant wail. I scrambled to my feet and bolted down the stairs, skipping steps and gripping the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I was outside on the sidewalk, gulping in the cold night air. I looked up at the building, half expecting to see her peering out from one of the windows. But the 12th floor was dark, as it always was. The next day, I filed a formal complaint with building management. I didn't go into detail, just said there was something strange on the 12th floor. They dismissed it, saying it was impossible for anyone to access the space. It had been sealed for asbestos removal after the fire. I never took the stairs again, not even during fire drills. I quit the job a few months later, and every time I pass that building downtown, I feel a chill run down my spine. Months after I quit that job, I thought I put the experience behind me. I even started laughing it off when recounting it to close friends over drinks, turning it into one of those crazy work stories people tell to spice up dull conversations. But deep down, I knew I wasn't being entirely honest. The memories still haunted me in quiet moments, creeping back when I was alone or in dark, silent spaces. One night, about a year later, I woke up at 3:12 a.m., the kind of waking where your body feels electrified, like it knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. My apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of my refrigerator. But something felt wrong. My ears strained against the quiet. That's when I heard it, a faint, familiar humming. I sat bolt upright, my pulse thundering in my ears. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was inside, drifting from somewhere down the hall. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't a song from a passing car or a neighbor's late night TV. It was the same haunting tune from the 12th floor. No, I whispered, shaking my head as if denying it would make it disappear. The humming grew louder, more erratic, as though whoever or whatever was making it was drawing closer. My eyes darted to my bedroom door, slightly ajar, revealing the dark hallway beyond. I didn't remember leaving it open. I wanted to move, to grab my phone, to turn on a light, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place, every muscle locked in terror. Then I saw it. A shadow passed through the sliver of light in the hallway, faint but unmistakable. It stopped, and the humming ceased abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the crack of the door, waiting, hoping it was my imagination. And then a whisper, low, guttural, and unmistakable, "Come see." The door creaked open slightly, just enough for me to glimpse a figure standing at the end of the hallway. My blood turned to ice. It was her, the same woman from the 12th floor. Her face was even more distorted than I remembered, the grin impossibly wide, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. She didn't move, but the air around her seemed to shimmer and bend, as though she was barely tethered to reality. I don't remember how I finally managed to move, but the next thing I knew, I was running out of my apartment barefoot, not even bothering to grab my keys. I fled down the street, not stopping until I reached an all-night diner where I sat shaking until sunrise. When I returned home later that morning, exhausted and half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing, I found my apartment door ajar. Nothing was missing, but the place felt rugged. The air was heavy, and there was an unfamiliar smell, faintly metallic, like burnt wires. I moved out the next week, breaking my lease without a second thought. I've never experienced anything like it since, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet hours of the night, I'll hear the faintest hum in the distance. This happened a couple of years ago when I was working part-time as a receptionist at a small law firm downtown. It wasn't a flashy place, just an office suite on the 4th floor of an older building. The work was monotonous but easy: answer the phone, greet clients, and sort the mail. One afternoon, a man walked and carried a thick stack of folders. He looked completely unremarkable, mid-40s, thinning hair, wearing a beige suit that had seen better days. He smiled politely and said he had a delivery for one of the attorneys, Mr. Hill. I asked if he had an appointment, and he said no, but he insisted Mr. Hill was expecting him. I didn't recognize him, but Mr. Hill often had walk-in clients, so I didn't think much of it. I called Mr. Hill's office to let him know someone was here for him. Mr. Hill sounded confused and said he didn't know anyone by that description. When I relayed this to the man, his demeanor changed. The polite smile vanished, replaced by a look that made my skin crawl. "Just tell him it's urgent," he said, his tone sharp. Who notes to say those? He tapped the folders on the counter with an intensity that felt almost threatening. At this point, I started to feel uneasy, but I nodded and called Mr. Hill again. This time, he sounded annoyed. "I don't know who this guy is, and I'm not seeing him. Tell him to leave." When I relayed the message, the man's face darkened. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there staring at me. Then he leaned in closer, too close, and whispered, "He'll regret this." I froze. My heart was pounding, but I managed to keep my voice steady as I told him he needed to leave. He finally backed away, but as he reached the door, he turned back and said, "You should be careful, too. Some secrets are dangerous." After he left, I locked the door and called building security. They took a report but didn't seem overly concerned. When I told Mr. Hill what had happened, he brushed it off, saying he had no idea who the man was or what he could have wanted. The whole thing felt off, but I tried to move on. A week later, I found a single folder on the reception desk when I came in for my shift. I didn't know how it had gotten there. There was no sign of forced entry, and no one else had access to the office. The folder was labeled with my name in blocky, uneven handwriting. Inside were pages and pages of photocopied documents, court records, old newspaper clippings, and what looked like medical reports. As I flipped through them, I realized they all had one thing in common, a recurring name. My last name. It was a name I didn't recognize, tied to events and people I had no connection to. Or so I thought. When I showed the folder to Mr. Hill and the office manager, they both looked concerned but couldn't make sense of it. We reported it to the police, but without any clear threat. They didn't have much to go on. I quit that job not long after. I didn't feel safe there anymore, especially knowing the man hadn't been caught or identified. I still think about that day sometimes, wondering who he was and how he knew my name. I don't work in offices anymore, and I've moved twice since then, but every now and then, I catch a glimpse of the beige suit or a stack of folders, and my heart races. After I left the law firm, I tried my best to put the incident behind me, but even after I started my new job at a small boutique, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't constant, but every so often, I'd catch someone staring just a moment too long or notice a figure lingering at the edge of my vision. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was overreacting. Still, I couldn't ignore the knots of unease that tightened in my chest whenever I thought about that man. A few months later, I received a package at my apartment. It was strange because I hadn't ordered anything, and the sender's address was blank. My stomach dropped when I saw my name scrawled across the front in the same uneven handwriting from the folder at the office. Inside was an unmarked USB drive and a single slip of paper. The paper read, "You deserve to know the truth." I debated whether to throw it away, but curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I plugged the USB into my laptop. It contained dozens of files, photos, scanned documents, and videos. As I opened the first folder, a chill ran down my spine. The photos were of me, some were from years ago, pictures of me at college events, with friends, even family gatherings I didn't remember being photographed at. Others were more recent, including shots of me at the law firm and in my new neighborhood. Whoever had taken them had been watching me for a long time. I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I opened one of the scanned documents. It was a birth certificate, mine, but beneath my name was a note written in red ink, not her real name. The other documents were just as bizarre, legal papers about a child custody battle from decades ago, hospital records mentioning a Jane Doe infant, and police reports tied to missing persons cases. One of the videos was surveillance footage of a hospital hallway showing a woman I didn't recognize walking out with a bundled up baby. The timestamp was from the year I was born. I slammed my laptop shut and immediately called the police. They sent someone over to collect the USB drive and the package, but once again, there wasn't much they could do. The officers suggested I stay with a friend for a while, just to be safe, and I took their advice. For weeks, I was too afraid to go home. I stayed with my best friend, Emma, and told her everything. She tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a stalker trying to mess with my head, but her concern was obvious. Then, one night, while we were watching TV, Emma's dog started barking at the front door. It was a low, growling bark, the kind he only made when something was wrong. I peeked out the window, but the street was empty. I tried to shake it off, but the dog wouldn't settle down. When Emma opened the door to check, she found another package sitting on the doormat. This one was smaller, wrapped in plain brown paper with no note attached. She wanted to throw it away immediately, but I couldn't. sent. I had to know what was inside. We opened it together. Inside was a single Polaroid photo of a young girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing next to the man with the folders. They were in front of a house I didn't recognize, but the girl looked oddly familiar. Beneath the photo, someone had scribbled, "You were never supposed to leave." We called the police again, but just like before, there wasn't much they could do. The officers said the photo could have been doctored and that without a clear thread, there wasn't enough evidence to investigate further. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of knocking on Emma's door. It was just after 3 a.m. Emma and I froze, staring at each other as the knocking grew louder and more frantic. We didn't answer, and after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. When we checked the peephole in the morning, no one was there, but scratched into the wood of the door was a single word: leave. I've moved again since then, this time to another state. I've changed my phone number, deleted my social media, and done everything I can to disappear. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching me, waiting for the right moment to reach out again. After moving to another state, I did everything possible to erase my tracks. I got a new name for my mailbox, rented a place under a pseudonym, and used a VPN for everything online. I even started seeing a therapist to help me deal with the anxiety that had become my constant companion. For a while, it seemed to work. Months passed without any strange packages or unnerving encounters, and I started to believe I could rebuild my life. But then, late one evening, I got a phone call. The number was unknown, and I debated letting it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. I immediately regretted it. At first, there was silence. Then a man's voice, low and calm, said, "You can't hide forever." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there, staring at my phone, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself it was a prank call, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I reported it to the police in my new city, but there wasn't much they could do. They suggested changing my number again, which I did, but the damage was done. The fragile sense of security I had built was shattered. A week later, I came home from work to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart sank. I was certain I had locked it that morning. I hesitated, debating whether to go inside or call the police. Ultimately, I chose the latter. When the officers arrived and cleared the apartment, they didn't find anyone, but they did find something on my kitchen table, a single folder identical to the ones the man had carried into the law firm all those months ago. Inside was a handwritten note: "You keep running, but you're only making it worse. Stop now, and I'll explain everything." The rest of the folder was filled with more of the same: photos of me, documents with my name on them, and, most chilling of all, a timeline of my moves since leaving the law firm. They knew everything, every address, every job, every attempt I had made to start over. The police took the folder as evidence, but I knew what they'd say. No direct threat, nothing actionable. Once again, I was on my own. That night, I packed a bag and checked into a hotel under an alias. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even Emma. I couldn't risk it. I stayed there for a week, trying to figure out my next move. On the 6th night, I woke up to a strange sound, the rustling of paper. I turned on the bedside lamp and froze. The small desk in the corner of the room was covered in folders, dozens of them. They hadn't been there when I went to bed. On top of the pile was another note: "You can't run from the truth. It's time to come home." I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't even bother checking out of the hotel. I drove until I was out of the state, pulling over only when I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. Now, I'm constantly on the move, never staying in one place for more than a few days. I don't use my real name for anything, and I avoid making connections with people. It's a lonely existence, but it feels like the only way to stay safe. Sometimes, I think about that man with the folders and the cryptic messages he left me. Who was he? What did he mean by the truth? Part of me wants to find out, to confront him and end this nightmare once and for all. But another part of me is terrified of what I might discover. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.